So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to the last session of this semester series of the International Macrohistory online seminar. Today, we're very lucky to have Wolfgang Keller to present joint work with Carol Shui. But before I give the floor to Wolfgang, just briefly remind you of the rules of engagement. If you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You may also raise your electronic hand, but then you'll have to wait on the line for me to call you up later on. I will only interrupt Wolfgang during the first 40 minutes if there's a clarification question. So if you have one, type it for sure. After the 40 minutes, we'll have about 20 minutes Q&A. And for the enthusiasts, so people wanting to continue the discussion, there will be an extra 50 minutes after the hour. So this is fairly standard. Wolfgang is ready. Thanks very much for bringing your paper to the series, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rui, for having me, and to everybody at CEPR who has helped organizing this. Let me share my slides. Everybody can see them, I hope. And yes, so this is joint work with Carol Shui. And we're going to go to 19th century China. Here is the map of China with the points of foreign influence during this period. As you can see, there are locations along the coast as well as along the major rivers, some of them also a bit more inland. So here's what happened in the 19th century China with the Opium War. So the trading interests, the interest to trade with China were much larger for Western countries, in particular Britain, than for China at this point. The Chinese emperor rather saw foreigners as somewhat of like troublemakers, really. And so to pursue their interests, the British merchants imported illegally opium to China, and as was expected, a uncorrupt Chinese official confiscated and destroyed this opium, which the British then took as a violation of private property and started the Opium War, 1839. This was with a very swift defeat of China, and as the result, these so-called ports were opened by treaty, hence the name treaty ports. And so we're going to discuss in this paper the economic consequences of this Opium War. And so the paper is going to talk about the influence of Western colonialism and what it did after the Opium War that concluded in 1842 to the Chinese economy. And so the first point here is arguably the most important in our analysis. So from the point of view of Western historians, there's a mix of exploitation and modernization, but the general consensus is that because these were these isolated ports in a very large empire of China, that Western influence was too small to matter one way or another, and that China is impermeable really to change during this period. So it didn't really, there's a famous statement by Rhodes Murphy. He says that these treaty ports were like a fly on an elephant, annoying, but can't really change the whole thing. And this is where we are trying to make a contribution. And we're going to actually find that there was a positive impact on Chinese economy. And there's some literature that actually has a similar inkling, literature as well as facts. For example, there were, in addition to these treaty ports, there were ports that China self-opened. So, about 10 of them, 10, 12 of them. And so that would have not happened, presumably, if there wasn't any benefit from these trade, these treaty ports that were opened by force due to these treaties. But the big picture really here is that there's no study that exists right now that shows sizable gains throughout China, and so that's our finding. That's the plan of what we're trying to do in the next couple of minutes. So the points of influence, we're going to focus on three types of influence points. First, they were the treaty ports that are most well known. The treaty ports, basically, what happened there in 1842 with the conclusion of the Opium War, countries, starting with Britain, got the rights to trade and settle down at that port. But because of most favored nations clauses, this right to Britain was very quickly expanded to essentially all Western countries. There were also customs stations in a larger of these treaty ports, and the customs was actually led starting in 1854. It was led by essentially a Western bureaucracy. So the leaders were trained at Harvard, Oxford, Yale, you name it. So that was a very different customs service compared to what existed before. And they were also, and that's somewhat lesser known, important points of influence were these foreign consulates. So they were by the end of the 19th century, hundreds of foreign consulates from different countries. And why that mattered, perhaps, is the fact that foreigners were not subject to local Chinese law, but they were subject to the laws of their country of origin, which is called extraterritoriality. And the first court of instance was typically the consular court, and with the consul actually as the judge, although some foreign countries had also trained dedicated officials, not the consul. But the first court essentially was the consular court, and for that reason, this mattered. We're going to try to understand in particular also the channels of influence and how that might have happened. And the most important aspects that I'll be trying to highlight are given here in blue. We're going to try to document that the influence of Western colonialism in China during the 19th century had to do with technology spillovers, which affected industrialization, and there were foreign firms and foreign machinery, including steam, but also other advanced machinery. We've also will be talking about a domestic policy response, which is called the self-strengthening movement, that took off after the Second Opium War, 1861, and lasted until 1895. And so that was in a response, in a way, to the Chinese defeat in the Opium Wars, and it focused on military and industrial technology. Now, these customs stations were important because, after all, the main point of interest of Western countries was to increase their foreign trade with China, and so we're going to study some mechanism related to foreign market access. And finally, these consulates, we believe, and we try to convince you of, provided important security spillovers in the in the sense that they lowered the risk of all sorts of economic transactions, but in particular, capital market transactions. So here's the timing of the influence. So this is the number of Chinese regions, which are called prefectures in our case, that are touched in a way by a treaty port, one of these customs station or foreign consulate. You see that they are starting in 1842. This is when the first Opium War concluded, but then that proceeded, as we see here, in a bunch of so-called waves, and our estimation is going to try to account for that. Now, we're going to study the impact of these Western colonial elements in China in terms of, broadly speaking, two outcomes. The first are measures of industrialization. And so we're going to look at the number of industrial firms, but that includes also ship repair, mining, so not strictly speaking only factories, proto-industrial and industrial firms, we can call it. And we're going to also look at capital markets by studying regional interest rates. Now, these interest rates, they come from a model together with monthly grain prices. That can be done because the interest rate is part of a storage cost. And so that is a theory that goes back to Calder and Holbrook and Samuelson, in fact. And some people might actually have remember that McCloskey and Nash did a paper on medieval interest rates in the 1980s. And so let me just show you very briefly how this works. Oh, it doesn't want me to do this. How about this guy here? How do we get to, I'm sorry. So it doesn't seem to work the way it worked earlier. No, so let me skip it and proceed here. So the interest rates, they come from a model of storage together with high frequency grain prices. So the estimation framework for an analysis is, let me just give you the model by doing it the old-fashioned way of jumping down here. Okay, so here's the model of price behavior of commodity storage model. So we have here two price series from an equilibrium commodity storage model that are shown in this graph here. We have one with a high interest rate, that's the blue line here. It is cyclical, as you see, very systematic. And we have a lower interest rate, which is this red series here. And the difference between the two is, of course, the amplitude of this seesaw pattern. And that's because the price in equilibrium has to cover the cost of storage. And so we have backed out regional interest rates for more than 250 prefectures in China at an annual frequency, and doing that, and using this method. And that has been also recently validated in some research that we have in Cleometrica. So going back to the estimation framework, it's a difference in difference estimation framework where we have an outcome such as industrialization, the number of industrial firms, is related to a measure of foreign influence. That's the consulate, treaty port, or customs indicator. And we also have, in addition to that measure, we have two-way fixed effects. That's for the prefecture subscript I, as well as the year fixed effect, which is the subscript T. And in addition to deal with shocks, we have province year fixed effects, as well as controls for potential omitted variables such as rebel activity, weather shocks, macro, and trends. Okay, so two-way fixed effects, a very standard procedure. We're going to use not only indicator variables for these, whether there is at least one open consulate in this region or not in this year, but also we're going to use the number of consulates, number of treaty ports. Some of these regions, such as the area around Guangdong down in the south of China, that around Canton, there can be actually multiple treaty ports in a given prefecture. Now, this is a very established model. We're going to extend this in order to estimate the geographic scope of foreign influence in China. And we're going to extend this using looking at this term here. So this is the new thing. So what we have here is there's a measure of the foreign influence in distance bands around some prefecture I. And for example, there's going to be distance bands at 150 kilometers width. So let me explain how this works. So suppose we're looking at this particular prefecture here with this red star. So this red star, that's the prefectural capital, and you see there is no treaty port or consulate, foreign consulate at that particular prefecture. However, for that particular distance band that I'm showing here, the treaty port of Hankow is actually in that particular distance band. And so that basically then means that if there's a geographically dispersed effect of foreign influence, then this particular prefecture which has its capital at this red star is going to perhaps, and that's what we're going to test for econometrically, be influenced by some kind of treaty port effect from Hankow. And so we're doing this for each one of these, for this prefecture here, the red star prefecture, we're doing this with these distance bands. So, okay, so we start really small, up to 150 kilometers, then to 300, 450. And that allows us to see how far that this geographically dispersed effect reaches, if it reaches at all. And then we're going to do these sets of what you can also call donuts here. These sets of donuts, we're going to actually apply those to all of the prefectures, around 250 of these prefectures of China. And so you see having these 250 sets of these donuts here over the map of China will give us a pretty good sense of what, if any, of this geographically dispersed effect there was at that time. So that's the game plan. And the main result of the paper, which I'm going to spend the remaining 25 minutes to develop, is that there was a positive impact throughout China. So what do we have here? We have the interest lowering effect of foreign influence that's predicted by our baseline regression. And so these different colors give us by how much the capital cost, the interest rate in a given region was reduced. And so what we see here is that the light blue, which is mostly the northwestern areas, this is Gansu province, Shaanxi also as well, these places have not been significantly affected. So they're in this lowest of these different sets of regions. Whereas everything else, which turns out to be more than 85% of the part of China that we're studying, is significantly affected. So not only these treaty ports, these points in China, but if you are incorporating these geographically dispersed effects that we're estimating, then it's going to be actually an effect throughout China. Okay, so that's where we're heading, and so let me move on. An obvious question you might have is, well, these foreign locations in China, weren't they selected by these people? And so yes, we do recognize that, and we are applying inverse probability weighted regression adjustment, where we are first asking what kind of places were generally being picked by foreigners as their treaty ports or foreign consulate locations. And we see here it was mostly southern, coastal, as well as on the Yangtze River, and also places that had a relatively high population in 1776. So that's 50 years before our sample starts. And so we're going to apply these weights throughout in order to get more to an apples and apples comparison, in order to not rely on inferences that are, you know, using as a control group areas that have no chance of ever becoming a treaty port. We're also doing a more drastic selection type of analysis. Instead of looking at all of these prefectures, which we have here, the capitals in the left picture, we're actually looking at those that were most likely picked based on this propensity score that I just showed you with the Provit regression. And so they were in the southern, southeast and coastal areas. And so we're going to look at a subsample in order to make sure that we're okay with our inferences. Okay, this is a difference in difference. So one should ask whether there are pre-treatment characteristics that are different between treated and controlled prefectures. We have here done this for interest rates in the pre-Opium War period, pre-end of Opium War. We also have gone 50 years before the sample, and there are either no statistically significant differences in the treatment and control, meaning where there was foreign influence versus where there was not, or the differences actually favor the control regions. And so that confirms conventional wisdom. There's not generally the most important or promising regions were picked. That probably can be made most, it can be stated most clearly in the case of Shanghai. Fairbank, in his handbook chapter in 78, said that Shanghai was historically a small city since the 13th century. There was little growth in Shanghai during the early 19th century. And yet, Shanghai arguably became the most important of these treaty ports over time. So let's move to our first sets of results, and that's in terms of outcome variables, industrial firms and machinery. We see here that whether if there was a treaty port or a consulate, so that's a 0-1 indicator for either or, then the industrial firms there were more industrial firms and there was more industrial machinery, significantly so, conditional on these year fixed effects, these prefecture year fixed effects, as well as all other controls, the most important being these province by year fixed effects that eliminate all shocks at the level of the province. And so we also estimate a positive impact on the steam engine adoption, and we see from these results here, if we split this into treaty port versus consulate, that industrialization, Chinese industrialization, so Chinese-owned industrial firms, that was more affected by the treaty port locations than by these foreign consulates. The full dynamic picture actually looks like this. So here we estimate, instead of an average difference in difference effect, we're estimating one coefficient for every year relative to opening. And so that's what you get for the number of industrial firms. So it confirms that there is some uptick here. It takes a while, as you see, of maybe 15, 16 years until it becomes significant. It also confirms that there's no differential pre-trend, which is what we see here on the left side. Okay, now we want to then make sure that the selection doesn't matter. So we actually compare this with this coastal sample of regions, you know, the restricted, this is less than, that's around 1/3 of the sample. But you see that the coefficient here is very similar to what we find for the overall sample. So it doesn't seem to be that selection of these regions plays a big role for our results. We also study, because these treaty ports were opened in waves. That's one of the reasons of why you might worry about heterogeneity. There has been a lot of work on difference in different estimation recently, and we apply the method of oh yeah, now it works again. The method of Kirill, Borusyak, Yaraval, and Spies, and we are estimating this in the, you know, and we, as you see here, the coefficient of 0.12 is very close to the coefficient of 0.13 that we get with a simple OLS estimator. And we can actually look at this in a bit more detail. And we see that, you know, this year gives the annual coefficients from that event study design, and these heterogeneous effects consistent coefficients are very close, so a correlation of 0.95 or higher to the OLS coefficient. So that doesn't matter for us in a big way. Good. So we also have dropped, because we want to know whether this is a Western effect or just a foreign effect. The most important non-Western countries here were Russia and Japan. They did not ever first open one of these treaty ports, but they did have their own foreign consulates. But if we're dropping those observations, results, as you see here, do not change very much. Okay, now let's move on to interest rates as the left-hand side variable. And now what we see here is that we see negative coefficients. Let's make sense of this. So this means that if there is a treaty port in a particular prefecture and year, then interest rates are lower, all else equal. And so you have to look at this by comparing it to the interest rate mean in the sample, which is about 7.5%. And so either there's a treaty port or a consulate. In fact, consulate, the coefficient is larger, as you can see in absolute value. That is associated with a lower interest rate in this particular region, a lower cost of capital, so that's a good thing. And if you apply that either or treaty port or consulate variable, then the coefficient is in the order of -2.4. And so that's more than a quarter of the interest rate mean during this time. So thought about it this way, it's a substantial reduction. Now, we are adding now this geographic dispersion term to the analysis, that is these distance bands. And so there are a couple of important results, and I have switched now to showing you bold coefficients if they are statistically significant with clustered standard errors. And so the coefficient without these distance bands is -2.37, and that switches to 2.8, -2.8 with these first set of distance bands. And the distance bands itself enter with a negative coefficient. So that's there's two important implications of it. First of all, the simplest point-based different diff result is not the total effect, because we actually have additional significant coefficients. And we also see that the total effect here must go up, because the interest rate reduction where the treaty port itself has gone up in absolute value, and then there's a further reduction from these additional treaty ports. Okay, so that's in a way you can think of this as that the simplest difference in difference without these distance band terms is underestimating the effect. And then we can keep on adding more of these distance bands here step by step, first 150 to 300, then 300 to 450. And we then end up with a result where The consulates and treaty ports are significant in terms of their interest lowering effect up to 300 kilometers and treaty ports up to 450. So this here is significant at standard levels, whereas this is a 0. And then we can go one step further, and then we find that these 450 to 600 terms, they are not significant. And so we can conclude there's no effect, no dispersed effect beyond distances of 450 kilometers. And we also see, and that's an important result in order to understand what's the nature of these effects, that the size of these coefficients generally declines. It declines in absolute value. And so that there's a localization, geographic localization of this interest rate effect. And that makes sense because geography would be a barrier to the transactions, to these capital market transactions of people. You have to actually go to the center of the town in order to perhaps make these capital market transactions. So if there's a change in security, or there's a change in the amount of risk, that's going to affect people more who are closer to the treaty port or consulate rather than those that are 300 or 600 or 800 kilometers away. Okay, so this gives us already a sense of what's the nature of these effects. Another one is coming from this results here. As you can tell, there's negative significant coefficients or statistical zeros. So there's no mix of positive coefficients that are significant and negative that are significant. So that basically gives us a sense that there is no major reallocation. It's not that these treaty port areas benefited at the expense of non-treaty port areas. It seems to be more consistent with that there's some kind of a positive externality effect that, as we will see, has to do probably mostly with security spillovers. But there's no evidence for reallocation. So this all leads to this picture that I have shown you already earlier. So if we take the predicted effects from this regression that we just had, the final specification, and we plot this on a map of China where we have prefectural boundaries here of 1820, then we have the result that there's significantly lower interest rates in 87% of the Chinese regions where we have data. And so that is by far not, it is of course, yes, it is true that very strong effects, the darkest of these colors, are in the Shanghai area and also along the Yangtze River, also down around Canton, the Pearl River in today's Guangdong province, as well as in Taiwan, as you can tell, which is part of Fujian province. But the effects go far beyond that. As I said, more than 80% is covered. So let's try to understand the mechanisms of that. So we're expanding, first of all, we look at foreign market access. That was a prime motive. And so we're doing this by adding a new term where this foreign influence indicator is, which is customs right now, is interacted with a measure of trade. And we see from this table here that both imports, foreign imports, as well as foreign exports matter. In fact, exports matters more in a horse race. It is exporting a relatively high share of a particular customs station in foreign exports that matters. That makes sense. Export capability to sell on world markets. And that's consistent with some kind of learning effect from interacting with these foreign firms. And size-wise, this is about it's about 1/3 of the effect. So mechanism, clearly one mechanism for these effects that we're estimating is improvements in foreign market access. We also ask ourselves, could perhaps foreign firms have something to do with the growth of Chinese-owned firms? And so we have data on foreign-owned firms in these ports. Many of them were British, as you can tell, and many of them were in Shanghai, but we know where they came from. And we are looking at this domestic policy response called self-strengthening movement. Here's a picture of how many of these prefectures were touched by so-called self-strengthening projects. And as you can tell, simply eyeballing this from this graph, it's consistent with the idea that there was an endogenous policy response. Did these things matter? Yes, we see here that if we are including foreign direct investment, the number of foreign firms as well as these foreign banks, that actually totally replaces these dummy variables, the significance of these dummy variables. So this is consistent with FDI spillovers, also information provided by foreign banks in terms of financing playing a role. And these self-strengthening projects also are important in reducing the size of these treaty port and consulate variables, which are in some sense black box, and we're trying to better understand. Now, we know that there was foreign firms and foreign banks in China. So could it be that these lower interest rates just have to do with more capital? And so this is what we're analyzing here. This is the coefficient. This is without these additional measures of foreign capital supply. And we see that actually there's no evidence that there's lower interest rates in these local markets due to foreign capital. This coefficient here is positive, but it goes in the wrong direction. So we're concluding from this that quantity changes in supply in particular, are not the primary reason of why we have lower interest rates. It's much more consistent with also the dispersion effects that we're estimating are more consistent with security spillovers and lower risk factors. Okay, last step in terms of analysis of the mechanisms is that we want to explain the geographic dispersion. So far, the analysis has focused on what are the mechanisms underlying the West's effect in prefecture I, or you might call that the prefecture of location. And now the goal is to actually shed light on the mechanisms that underlie the dispersed effects. And so in order to do this, we are going to expand that distance band specification with another term where we allow for this mechanism MI to matter for this geographically dispersed effect that we're estimating. Okay, and so the two mechanisms that we're going to focus on are exports in the case of these treaty port effects, these dispersed treaty port effects, and we're going to look at the strength of extraterritoriality for these consulate effects that we're estimating. Let's move first to these treaty ports. So we have here now two specifications, and we have the same control variables in the specification. I'm just suppressing them here in order to keep this manageable. So we have here the effect in the prefecture itself. So that would be the standard difference in difference type of analysis. And then we have these coefficients for three different distance bands, those that were individually significant. That's 0 to 150, 150 to 300, 300 to 450. And as I was pointing out earlier, there's a decline in the size of the coefficients there. So there's consistent with the idea that there's geographic dispersion, and the strongest effects are in the treaty ports itself, and then decaying with distance, consistent with the idea that frictions in geographic space, especially transport costs for goods or in particular for people, matter. And so if we're now, and that's the new part, if we're now adding these new variables, so the share of exports interacted with that distance band, then we get negative point estimates for all of these. Again, that's consistent with not much of a reallocation effect, but they are insignificant for short distances, and they're only significant, but then with a relatively high coefficient for the largest distances. And so what this means, what this coefficient of -5 roughly translates into, is that the port, customs station, a treaty port that accounts for a large share of Chinese foreign exports, has a much larger reach than a smaller port. Okay, so there's no difference between the average between small and large ports for these relatively short distances. So these coefficients here are insignificantly different from 0. However, it is significantly different, and so that basically means that the large distance type of spillover effects are accruing primarily to the largest treaty ports, which would be Shanghai, Tianjin, Hankow, Wuhan today, and Canton. Okay, so the volume of foreign trade clearly matters, and it is the largest ports where we're estimating the strongest effects. Let me move to the consulate dispersed effect. For this, we're actually quantifying the strength of regional extraterritoriality. So there's two facts that are important here, namely different Western countries exercise different levels of extraterritoriality in China. And so you should think of this as stronger extraterritoriality, which would basically boil down to the application of foreign law, versus less strong. That means that basically they do not really apply so much their own laws, the laws of the origin country, but they are applying laws that are more in line with Chinese law. That's fact number one. Fact number two is different Chinese regions attracted to some extent different foreign countries. For example, France had a relatively strong presence in the southwestern province of Yunnan. Germany had a relatively strong presence in the province of Shandong. And so these two facts taken together allow us to now use these different strengths in extraterritoriality in order to understand more to understand better these effects. And we're doing that in terms of 4 dimensions. Let me see, and these 4 dimensions are the scope of the jurisdiction, whether they were allowed appeals, whether assessors were allowed to go to mixed court proceedings, and whether these foreign countries had prisons in China. So I could talk for a couple of hours just about that. This is a super interesting part of the analysis, we think. But let me summarize this briefly. What's important is we're coding essentially these different strengths of extraterritoriality by which countries' consulates had the maximum that was present in China at the time. And so there are different sets of countries, for example, in terms of scope of jurisdiction. Did they try in China only civil cases or also criminal cases? And if criminal, would they do a murder case or only some theft or robbery? And so several countries, including Sweden, had would do anything, every kind of legal proceedings in China, whereas other countries would not. And that's the kind of variation that we're using here. And so let me just show you the definition of the variable that we're creating. It is it's an indicator that in a particular region, prefecture, there was maximum extraterritorial legal influence present in this area. And so that's the variable that we're using. So this is the same kind of structure as the results that I've just shown you. First, we have only these distance bands that you already saw, and then we're adding the distance bands interacted with that extraterritorial indicator. And so what we see is that in distances up to 150 years, strong extraterritorial influence significantly adds to this interest lowering effect. So extraterritoriality matters, and so the strength of the extraterritoriality matters for the dispersed legal effect, and the size of the volume of foreign exports matters strongly for the dispersion of that trade effect associated with treaty ports. So I'm almost out of time, so let me I've done already a couple of robustness checks and things, and we can talk about some more. Let me just move to the conclusion here. So we hope to have convinced you that the West had a positive effect on China's economy. It had a positive effect in terms of a difference in difference sense, which estimates a relative effect. We've seen that Western presence lowered interest rates that led to more industrialization. But we want to go a little bit further. We actually have conducted various analyses that actually have shown that affected regions did not gain at the expense of others. And so that actually then points towards net aggregate gains. Arguably, the most important result is that these effects are actually felt not just in these treaty reports. It's not just these two dozens of treaty reports, but actually these effects were felt throughout China. And the size of the interest rate reduction is in the order of, is larger than 25% at the ports themselves, but even at 450 kilometers of distance, it's still in the order of a 10% reduction compared to regions that are not affected. And the mechanisms that we think had played a key role are technology spillovers, technology learning, especially associated with these foreign firms, and security spillovers in the sense that there's evidence of lower interest rates, even though there's no evidence too much of changes in supply and demand, and foreign market access changes played a role. So that's it. Thanks very much, and I'd be happy to discuss further issues.
Thank you very much, Volkan. We already have a queue of questions. So let me start with a question that is shared by Miley Zavaro and Dick Silla, and this is about the effect of the presence of foreign banks. So Dick asks if foreign banks did little to reduce the cost of capital, as one of your heterogeneity results shown. Were there other domestic financial developments that might have been stimulated by the creation of treaty ports, consulates, and so on? And related, Melis asks, where exactly did these foreign banks located? Only in the treaty port cities, or also elsewhere, perhaps along those donuts of increasing distance that you've shown?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I think these are really interesting questions. There was an earlier draft in which we tried to have an analysis of how and whether these whatever foreign influence there was, in particular, perhaps through these foreign banks, whether that stimulated the growth of modern Chinese banks. Unfortunately, the data is highly imperfect, so we moved away from that. But that's a good idea. It's definitely worth thinking about, and if somebody has better information than what we were able to find so far, that would be great. And the question about these foreign banks is also interesting, in particular because we are estimating, as you see from this table here, column 2, we estimate that these foreign banks are associated with industrial firm growth. However, they don't seem to be adding to the interest rate lowering effect. So you see this coefficient, if foreign banks would actually help the increasing capital supply, then you would expect a negative coefficient, but it turns out it's positive. So we're interpreting this, the presence of foreign banks mostly in terms of they're contributing to giving project advice and to the creation of these firms. Many of these foreign banks, in fact, almost all of them, HSBC, for example, and being an important one, would also be located in the treaty port areas where also the consulates are. The correlation between consulate location and treaty ports is 0.8, and between foreign banks and treaty ports is, I would guess, at least 0.9. And that also explains essentially why you can't really separately identify this. But if it would be a big story about increase of capital, then I would expect that all the explanatory power loads on foreign banks, and it goes away from these dummy variables of treaty ports and consulates.
Yeah, but picking back precisely on that point, it's unclear who moved more, right? Demand or supply. And of course, these banks wouldn't locate randomly, even within the set of treaty ports, right? So a positive coefficient on foreign banks might just seem to imply that they located where they expected their business to be thriving, right? Because there was a big interest rate wedge that they could explore, right?
Yeah,
they could undercut.
No, I agree. I take that point, but it's useful to think about this also in the context of what are we trying to say? What we're trying to do here is to sort of ask whether these treaty port and consulate effects that we're estimating, which is in some sense just a black box. We just, it's a 0-1 variable, or maybe it's the number here of treaty ports that are exist in a prefecture, whether we can actually account for that. And yeah, so we are thinking actually of these additional variables such as the foreign direct investment, the foreign banks. We're thinking of this as approximate cost. So it's hard to actually separate them from the from these treaty ports or these consulate locations as such. I mean, I think that's most clear if you actually forget about these foreign bank and FDI variables for now, and you think about these missionaries. In the literature, there's results that say that, Protestant missionaries actually modernized China. They led to the creation of schools. They led to the creation of hospitals. And that's true. And that is an existing result in the literature. But if you think about how and why were these missionaries there, almost virtually all of the missionaries in 19th century China went there because they could due to these treaties. So in some sense, the treaty port opening is essentially the ultimate cause. And then, you can then ask yourself, how exactly did it work? And what we're finding, in fact, here is that at least during up to the 19th century, which is when our sample ends, missionaries didn't play a role. That apparently was different based on a by Kang paper in 1920. But we would think that missionaries or foreign banks or foreign firms are essentially the consequence of these treaties.
Clear. So I'm going to unmute Gabriel Matey, who has been waiting patiently.
Oh, sorry, I didn't have anything. Sorry, it must have been a mistake.
Oh, okay, all right. So there's further questions on the queue. So Melis again, now she's asking about trade. So on the opening of this maritime customs offices, she thinks that they would, the income might mostly be repatriated back to Europe. Was this the case, or was part of it invested locally? And who were the key participants in this treaty port capital market that might bring liquidity that could have pushed, apparently not, interest rates down? So essentially mixing the previous question, but with a different institution.
Okay, so let's first talk about the Chinese Maritime Customs Service. That's very interesting. Let me go to a slide that I had in the beginning. The Chinese Maritime Customs Service, even though it's Chinese, it was Western-led, was founded 1954, and the first station then really operated in Shanghai 1859. It was because during the Taiping Rebellion, these tariffs got uncollected, and then eventually the Westerners said, okay, we're going to run the Chinese customs system for them. And so what they did was they had created also beautiful data, which we've worked on in other projects. And they then they collected tariff revenue, very low tariffs, almost close to zero, but still positive. That's why they had to collect all this data. And then they deducted their expenses and sent the remainder of that remaining customs revenue to the Qing court. And China's revenue situation, the central government revenue situation, drastically improved due to the Chinese maritime customs, which was then run by Robert Hart for a very long time. And they were able to put that customs revenue, which was much more than what they were able to collect before, because these peripheral regions did not supply any customs revenue to the central government. They wanted to more or less get rid of the central government, and so they were able to borrow internationally at lower interest rates. So that's one of the very well-known effects of positive, economic effects that the Western
intervention
in China had. The second point on who were participating in these capital markets. Well, let me try to see whether I can get this to work. So in some sense, we are, in these capital markets, you would have, of course, merchants acting, to some extent farmers, but farmers only indirectly. In that sense, it is actually interesting that our data on these interest rates essentially is derived from agricultural grain markets. Think about it this way. Somehow I still haven't understood which exactly is the button here, but the model that we're using in order to back out interest rates is actually relying on the market price of grain in these prefectures, and the participants in that grain market would be almost entirely Chinese. So in that sense, we're actually thinking that the interest rates that we're computing are most strongly basically those interest rates that would be paid by Chinese as opposed to foreigners.
Right, thank you. Alejandra Irigoyen from LSE is proposing an interpretation for how you can get a differential interest rate effect without an effect from foreign direct investment. And this has to do with currency stabilization, which you mentioned in passing in the draft. So which, according to her, could be construed as an outcome of the treaty, the creation of the treaty ports by about 15 years later. And this would explain how you can get lower interest rates without capital inflows. What do you think of this interpretation?
I think that interpretation is pretty close to what we think is going on here. So let me move to that in the old-fashioned way. So this question of what interest rate effects are these? Is it this is this picture here. So an increase in capital supply. So this here is economics 101. An increase in capital supply is depicted here on the left, and so you would be, that might be associated with an increase in increase in supply, and therefore a reduction in interest rate for given demand. And so the effects that we're estimating, because we don't really find much results in our interest rate regressions in the context of FDI and foreign bank variables, our interpretation is that we're looking more at a reduced wedge type of a situation, which is what we have here on the right-hand side. And so I think the interpretation that was given is actually something that we would sign on to. Yes.
Yeah, because it would provide more liquidity and lower transactions costs. Chris Meissner, UC Davis has a question. Chris, you can ask yourself.
Hey, Wolfgang, this is very interesting stuff. I'm wondering about immigration from the countryside to the cities. Shanghai is an example of massive population growth, and well, I'm unsure whether that was driven by the treaty ports or some third factor driving both the treaty ports and the migration. So I'm looking for comparisons of cities that had massive immigration, with and without treaty ports. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so there was massive, I mean, generally we don't know much, let's put it this way, in terms of these, in terms of data that we could actually really use for an analysis. But anecdotally, what we know is that, and that's another aspect of this positive effect that people have been emphasizing, at least anecdotally, is we know that temporarily the treaty ports were always overrun by people from the countryside whenever there was a rebel activity in the suburbs. Think about it this way, or in the sort of rural areas. So that has always been considered to be prima facie evidence for security spillovers, because people were more protected in these treaty ports then, because the Westerners had some garrison there and they had some military there in order to protect their interests at some level, and so that actually helped to help these people, and that had something to do with this migration. However, this was not really. I'm not aware of good data on long-run migration differences. I mean, Rushu Jia has a paper in Restat where she says that actually, at least during the 19th century, these treaty port areas had higher population growth than other treaty port areas, other areas of China that were not treaty ports. But she's primarily interested in the very long run effect. So what does this mean for 2010 or 2020? Now, but that's a result that we have. As I said, Fairbanks and others have established that Shanghai, for example, was not growing very fast between the 13th and the 19th century. But with the foreign intervention in China from the West in particular, these areas grew relatively more rapidly in terms of population growth. The problem is we don't really have population data for more than 4 cross sections between 1820 and 1950, whereas what we're using here is a sort of an annual data type of analysis. So we were trying to go for that. Of course, GDP data is not existing either for these regions.
Thanks. So this would be the end of the formal part of the seminar. I would like to thank Wolfgang again for bringing his super interesting work on the opening up of China to the international economy, as it were, but not in 1978, in 1941. At this point, I would usually remind you of the talk next week. There will be one because it's the last of the series. But to look for us in September, we'll circulate information on the next series in the whole semester. And of course, we look forward to see as many of you then as possible. So now we continue to the less formal part. I've been patiently waiting to ask my questions. So Wolfgang, here they are. So in your balance tests, you show that there's a significant difference in population growth between treaty and non-treaty areas, or treated and non-treated, right? And that the pre-trend was steeper for regions away from these treaty ports. And collating this with what Chris was asking about redistribution of population, couldn't you also interpret these results as a fact that the economic geography of China before foreign intervention was profoundly suboptimal? So if you were
that's a super interesting super interesting question. It gets me to let me just, in case not everybody remembers that result, let me go to this balance check quickly and then talk some more about this. But you're right. So it's true that the control regions had somewhat higher population growth than the treatment regions, and so that's this picture here. If people can see this. So both for the treaty port variable or the consulate variable as treatment, you have slightly, well, somewhat or slightly, in any case, significantly higher population growth. And so how is this, how could that indicate a suboptimal division of economic activity? And I mean, that is actually super interesting because I haven't shown you this, but we have a simple plot which basically just shows it shows, yeah, here, this is the one. So we basically show that the Treaty-Port era, you can think of this as a transformation to coastal emphasis, and that's along the lines of what you're talking about. So what this here is these are not estimated causal effects. These are just, we have basically that's a third-degree polynomial in latitude and longitude, and we've just plotted our interest rates. And so what you see then is that before the Opium War, and that's on the left side here, we see that the low interest rate areas, these dark gray and moderately gray ones, these are low interest rates. And then after the Opium War, once the Westerners came, you actually get a totally different pattern. You see that the high interest rates are the inland areas here, the light blue in the middle, and then there's these belts around that. So there has been, you could argue that in a way the West has contributed to changing the more important versus less important Chinese areas. And no surprise, basically these coastal areas that are important today even, and where the action is, they've essentially, you could think of this as a creation of this Western, focus on foreign trade and foreign market access. Yeah, so I totally agree with you. I'm not sure whether this graph here is in the latest draft. We have to sort of think about it because this is essentially just plotting data. It's a bit of a, yeah, it's not, after you've shown causal effects, it's sort of, but you can think of the causal effects as generating this transformation, yes. So in that sense, I agree with you totally.
Yeah, but not only this, I'm sure you understood what I meant, right? It's precisely because population growth was stronger away from the treaty ports that it looked like the Chinese themselves were, not optimizing their economic geography.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I agree. Mm-hmm. So interest rate levels are consistent with the population growth story. Totally.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you were to calculate market potential, for instance, using your population figures, maybe you could come up with some kind of counterfactual optimal distribution of population before the Opium War, and then compare it to what you actually get with the Opium War. Right? So rather than just thinking in terms of direct, Western influences, right, in terms of reducing capital costs, increasing property rights protections and so on, right? So you could have a more diffuse and perhaps more powerful effect.
I agree. I agree. This is a broader interpretation, but it could probably be done.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, won't work, but I think it could be done. And perhaps would move you away from this invidious discussion whether European semi-colonialism was good or bad, or what was in it for the Chinese. You want to comment? Or?
No. I mean, this of course opens up the broader question of so you're estimating effects on the economy, but the effects on the economy, I might give you even that they were positive, but they were just not so important. The most important ones are on political sovereignty and sovereignty and humiliation and so forth. And of course, you could also argue, and I think we have discussed this, we have a Vox piece out on this here, and we actually looked at the war deaths. And so the war deaths from the Opium War that were caused by Westerners were basically 1/1000th of the war deaths in the Taiping Rebellion, which caused about 20 to 30 million dead. And so if you think that the war deaths are are a big factor, then, well, China had thousands of those Opium War military confrontations during their domestically caused Taiping rebellion. So yeah, but that's a broad question where we can start talking really long.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we don't have the time. Just squeeze a couple more. Do we have a good sense of why the overall trend in interest rates is positive? And in particular, it almost looks like that there's a break in trend, a more positive gradient around about the 1840s. So it looks like, although, you identify a differential effect, right? So why is this?
Well, so this is the interest rates by treatment, but we have eliminated the long run, the overall trend. So the red here is the never has any influence, and the blue is at some point they had influence, but the overall trend is positive, especially let's say from 1860 on. And so, the reason for that, I think, is indicating the general economic decline or the general economic trouble in China in the 19th century. So China had, people say, its high point during the Qianlong era, which was 1735 to 1790 roughly, but as they started going into the 19th century, things were starting to fall apart. China wasn't industrializing the way Britain was and other parts of the world. And then towards the end of the 19th century, the increase in these interest rates has a lot to do with the general deterioration of, and eventually the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. So if I talk to Chinese people, especially Chinese economists, many of them say that this was just an incompetent regime, and it's always the case in China that at the end of the dynastic era, before dynastic change, things fall apart, and so that's what explains this overall trend. You can't really say that the overall trend has been caused by the Westerners, because we see here that actually in areas that were most strongly affected by Westerners, they actually bucked the trend. So you can actually think of, in a way, that the Westerners, what they did in China, they actually prevented the country to go to pot as much as everywhere else where they were not present. And so that's one interpretation. But it's not, and that would be against the Chinese PRC textbook explanation, it's not that China deteriorated during the 19th century in terms of its economy because of the Western influence. Actually, this graph here shows that that's not supported by evidence.
Right, although this is a partial equilibrium reasoning, right? So, you could argue that foreign intervention weakened overall institutions, led to deterioration of markets.
I agree. You could say that. You could say, well, it definitely, as I pointed out, it is a partial equilibrium framework in the sense that we have a difference in difference, so it estimates the relative effect.
Yeah.
However, we do not see these reallocation effects or these strong, there's no evidence that somehow you have a mix of negative and positive coefficients in these distance band regressions. I think that's the strongest evidence we have. It's not somehow, there's some kind of positive effect on China that just fades away as best as we can estimate that. But you could, of course, say, and that's a sort of a more broader argument, you could say that actually what's most important for economic development is state capacity. And as the Western intervention reduced Chinese state capacity, and therefore that caused the decline of China. Yeah. I would argue against that because, in my view, actually, for reasons such as I've mentioned, that, for instance, the customs revenue increased and they had less rebel activity in areas where the Westerners were present. They had these inflows of migrants into these treaty ports whenever there was rebel activity. For these reasons, I think that state capacity argument is is actually off. In my view, the Qing dynasty without Western intervention would have collapsed in 1850. And the fact that they collapsed only in 1911 has to do with, so in some sense, the Western influence probably slowed down the collapse of the Qing dynasty. That's my but it's of course hard to make that counterfactual convincingly.
So Nathan wants to have the last word. You had a question, Nathan.
Totally. Nathan?
Hi. I'm just, again, it's wrapping up this, we're in the last minute, but just a reflection that on the general equilibrium effects of this is it could be a comparison. Maybe, I mean, I don't want you to do extra work, but at least in the introduction or conclusion, is the Japanese case, where sort of their opening to trade was less violent, let's put it this way, from the Western intervention point of view. It was forced on them maybe for similar reasons by the Americans, but it led to a different growth path than China. It had potentially similar effects on sort of, opening up to trade and the benefits of trade, but without the, and they had a revolution obviously afterwards. So you're maybe right that the Chinese dynasty would have collapsed, but it might have been replaced, like in Japan, with something better. So it's not, I mean, this is just a general overview of this argument, as that you're opening to trade. You're obviously, as Rui was saying, you're changing sort of the way the economy is organized and etc. But there's what the Chinese are saying, in some sense, is the cost of occupation, humiliation, etc. And I think the Japanese case, which again has a lot of similarities, could provide some, it's just something to, for the introduction or conclusion to add that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nathan. That's a good idea. The comparison to Japan is interesting, no doubt. Meiji Restoration, 1871. There were a couple of big differences, even though between the Japanese and the Chinese case. In some of them are relatively straightforward to see. I guess Commodore Perry did this better than they did this in Britain. They did this in China. So he had these ships out there and he said, look, these are my ships. You can come and take a look at the cannons, and you should reform, you should change. Whereas in China, they did this differently. And there's also the thing, at least that's what I'm hearing from Carol when I talk to her, in terms of how China thought about itself and how Japan thought about itself in 1850 was different. So China sort of thought about itself more like the dominant Asian power. They had this tributary system for centuries. They really didn't know exactly why they should do something with these foreigners, and that sort of was a big effect. And the other thing is what Tom Roski always tells me when you compare Japan and China with their treaty ports. He sort of tells me that, the fraction of the country that is within 10 kilometers of a treaty port in Japan is way larger than in China. And so in some sense, and that's sort of this metaphor that I talked about, that Rhodes Murphy, who was a historian of the 1970s, the fly on the elephant's back, that's sort of what they thought was happening in China. So it's a huge country and many areas are far away from these treaty ports. And so in some sense, it doesn't matter so much for us, and we can get rid of them the way we could get rid of invaders for centuries before. And so that was the general thinking. That's at least my sense.
Right, this is fascinating, but we are up against our time constraint. So yes. Thanks again for Wolfgang for bringing the paper. Thanks for those who stayed on and asked more questions. And again, we look forward to see you back in September. Till then, have a good, safe and productive summer, and we'll see you back then. Bye then.
Bye.
Thanks very much.